Today I'm taking a look at one of the most prevalent entities in the Final Fantasy universe, and a recurring facet of comic relief across many of these games. Along with Biggs and Wedge, Chocobos, Gil and Cid, Gilgamesh is a staple of the series, and materialises as both hero and villain throughout his numerous appearances. He's also a fascinating character because the general consistency of his visual look and the consistency of his agenda as a sword-seeking wanderer throughout each of these occurrences in which he appears, compared to the constantly reimagined characters like Biggs and Wedge and Cid, has led to speculation by many fans that he is in fact the same character appearing in cameo across each game. Now, Gilgamesh's appearance and personality is directly comparable to two mythic and potentially historical figures, the first from Mesopotamian legend and the other from feudal Japanese folklore. The first is the eponymous king Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, largely regarded as civilization's first story, or at least the earliest story which mankind has on record. So, written around 2100 BC, this epic documents the adventures of the part human, part god Gilgamesh, who is an evil king that brutalizes and sexually oppresses his subjects. As punishment for his maltreatment of his people, the god of the sky, Anu, creates the being Enkidu, the wild man, and sends him to go and defeat Gilgamesh. And subsequently Gilgamesh overpowers and defeats Enkidu, but is so impressed by his strength and his prowess that they become best friends and adventure the world together. And by witnessing acts of goodness and seeing the goodness of, for example, Enkidu, who somewhat tames him, Gilgamesh goes on to become something more of a hero than an outright villain as he begins at the beginning of the epic. So, with regards to Final Fantasy, we can see a similar pattern of behaviour to this historical backdrop that transpires with most appearances of Gilgamesh, and particularly when he appears as an antagonist. In Final Fantasy V, defeating him leads Gilgamesh to acknowledge the strength and the plight of the party, much as he does with Enkidu in the epic story. And similarly, in Final Fantasy VIII, we see Cypher dispatching Odin, which prompts Gilgamesh's appearance, and he acquires the much coveted sword Zantetsuken. But rather than joining Cypher as a reward, Gilgamesh first tests his strength and aptitude to see if Cypher is worthy of him, and as we know, swiftly defeats Cypher before disappearing back into his interdimensional rift. Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy XV also see Gilgamesh as a boss intent on testing the strength of his competition, and in most of these game appearances he is accompanied by the faithful Enkidu, usually in the form of a dog or a sort of wolf creature. And this is further testament and correlation between Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy and Gilgamesh in the aforementioned Epic of Gilgamesh, where we have a man that's, intent on physically testing the party, and upon seeing their strength, much like with Enkidu, he goes on to befriend them, or at least respect them. Now, moving on to Gilgamesh's influences from feudal Japan, these come in the form of his common appearance, weaponry, and recurring bridge battles that transpire against the player. Through this, he is directly relatable to two Japanese historical figures, who are Minamoto no Yoshitsune and his faithful retainer, the warrior monk Benkei. Now, these two warriors actually existed, but much of their tales have slipped into the arena of legend, particularly through poems such as the Tale of the Heike. So, starting first with Benkei, this guy was a powerful warrior monk who, for reasons unknown, had taken to manning the Gojo Bridge in Kyoto and challenging soldiers and samurai who sought to cross the bridge. So he challenged them in battle, and he is said to have defeated all of them until he met Yoshitsune Minamoto, and upon being bested by Yoshitsune, and much like the aforementioned tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, he was so impressed by Yoshitsune's strength that he committed himself to Yoshitsune's cause for the rest of his life. So, again, parallels can be drawn here with how Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy treats the player after losing, and also he has this penchant for fighting on bridges, as seen in Final Fantasy 5, 12, 14, 15, and Type O, among others. So these attest to how the folkloric tale of Benkei fighting on the bridge and challenging people and respecting people is very consistent and similar with how we see Gilgamesh frequently appearing in the Final Fantasy games. Gilgamesh also has the recurring trait of dropping samurai-esque items known as Genji items, and Genji is actually the Sino-Japanese word, or the Chinese translation of Minamoto. So again, like Yoshitsune's Minamoto and the clan, who are also known as the Genji clan, we have a clear connotation with Yoshitsune, Benkei, and this feudal Japanese sort of folkloric tale that is directly comparable with Gilgamesh as he appears in Final Fantasy. And finally on this point, much like common depictions of the aforementioned Benkei, Gilgamesh, particularly in his early character sprites, commonly wields a naginata spear in his early Final Fantasy depictions, along with a general kind of monkish looking red cowl, which can be attributable to this Eastern influence we see here. So I noted that Gilgamesh is arguably a constant entity in the shifting worlds and realms of the Final Fantasy universe, and excusing his cameo in Final Fantasy IX and his dramatic redesign in Final Fantasy XV, there is a strong argument that this is indeed the case. Firstly, his inclusion in Final Fantasy IX is a subtle kind of inclusion to the game. He first appears as the dubious alleyway Jack in Alexandria at the beginning of the game and tries coercing Vivi into helping him steal things, and he later appears in Treno as the four-armed man. And it's only via a side quest and venturing into Togero he actually reveals that his name is Gilgamesh. There's also a note left by the unseen Enkedu, who says that he's been obtaining swords on his behalf, which is a reference to the ongoing status of Gilgamesh as a wandering swordsman. But aside from this, the design and characteristics of Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy IX are a radical departure from his usual feudal monk garb and sword-wielding demeanour. In Final Fantasy XV, we have an even larger departure from Gilgamesh, which sees him feature as a one-armed instead of a four-armed man. And the only reference to his status as a sword-seeking monk is the bridge lined with swords that which forms the battleground for Gladio. However, turning back to Gilgamesh as a constant in the series, and looking at the other occurrences of him appearing in these games, we do see him in a consistent red cowl, wearing kabuki paint, and often sporting numerous arms, by which I mean both weapons and also limbs. His consistency is bound to his ability to traverse dimensions, which is mentioned in his debut in Final Fantasy V. And, in fact, linking these games, in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VIII, when Gilgamesh appears to claim Zanetsuken, he references Bartz directly by name, which I believe is the first direct canonical crossover link between any Final Fantasy game, which is, this clear link between Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VIII. And it also indicates that this is indeed the same guy that's been traversing these games. And also in both games he mentions that, he's using interdimensional travel. He calls it, in Final Fantasy VIII, the interdimensional rift. So there seems to be a clear kind of sub-narrative being established with Gilgamesh here, that he is in fact, appearing canonically through many of these games. Finally, of course, seeing Gilgamesh as a constant is, of course, his plight and raison d'etre in most games, which is that of his incessant desire to obtain important swords. Every appearance sees Gilgamesh attempting to, or at least referencing this aim, indicating the character is, again, the same throughout each game. And Final Fantasy XII in particular is quite amusing for me because he boasts the weapons of each Final Fantasy hero, from Cloud all the way through to Tidus and Tidus's Brotherhood in his array of weapons. Just delving quickly now into symbolism, we've already referenced the Japanese influence and also the Mesopotamian influence, but there's actually Arthurian legend referenced with Gilgamesh as well, and Arthurian legend is probably one of the least drawn upon legends and myths in the Final Fantasy series. I mean, we have the Knights of the Round as a summon in Final Fantasy VII. But also, most importantly, Gilgamesh is always seeking King Arthur's sword, Excalibur, throughout each of his appearances, or most of his appearances. And the running gag here is that Gilgamesh is constantly only able to obtain Excalibur, which is the lackluster cousin of Excalibur, and is probably the most useless weapon to appear across any Final Fantasy game. So that about covers my brief thoughts pertaining to Gilgamesh and where he sits within Final Fantasy lore. Like Biggs and Wedge, he's a welcome staple in Final Fantasy, and doubtless I think he's likely to appear in future canonical installments as time wears on. Whether he's liable to retain his consistent appearance and look and demeanour from early games, or whether he continues to evolve as per Final Fantasy XV's rendition, this remains to be seen.